It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. A tale of two very different Miamis coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics, always welcome, especially when the viewer offers a modest stipend to defray the cost of a trip to Miami. So this isn't really sponsored content since I did pay most of my own way, but the Miami Transit Alliance did help out with travel, and they did make a compelling pitch for me to come visit their city and talk about it. The Transit Alliance is a nonprofit that's all about livable communities, safer streets, and improving transit for the 2.7 million people who live and work in Miami-Dade County. They specifically asked me to look at the 2023 mobility scorecard they put together, and I'm going to come back and touch on it periodically in this video because it really did help guide my exploration of the city. Just to be clear though, this channel does not exist to function as the mouthpiece for any particular advocacy organization. So as always, this is just going to be me sharing my own thoughts. And just to be fully transparent, when I say stipend, I mean they Venmo'd me enough cash to cover lunch and dinner over the course of 3 days at the only restaurant that really matters, which, by the way, if I have 6 different entrees, that only exhausts about 1/10% of the menu. Okay, let's talk about what makes Miami different. When you see pictures of Miami, it's probably glittering high-rises, so it looks like there's a lot of density. But at the same time, it does have sunbelt qualities to it. Outside the core, there's a lot of low-density sprawl and nasty street design. Another thing, South Florida is multicultural in a way that no other US city really is, just in terms of how strong the Latin American influence is. Lots of South American consulates, Argentinian restaurant/grocery stores, other Argentinian imports, but yeah, a fantastic South American and Caribbean food scene. I sincerely hope you guys didn't actually believe I went to the Cheesecake Factory. One other very particular thing that I think influences urbanism and transportation in Miami, the water table. It's like a couple feet down, and this place floods increasingly, which I'll come back to later in the video. But the upshot is, when it comes to rail transit, everything is elevated. So let's talk about Metrorail, the city's grade-separated heavy rail system. Opened in 1984, for a long time it was considered a billion-dollar boondoggle with disappointing ridership and almost none of the development around stations that was originally anticipated. The county approved a half-cent sales tax to upgrade transit starting in 2002, and while it's debatable how effective that's been, they did purchase a new fleet of Metrorail trains in 2017. I'm not going to relitigate the past, but my observation in 2023 is the service is pretty good, 8 to 12 trains an hour on the main trunk of the system, although the service after 8 p.m. is a bit questionable. So one way of looking at this is, it's incredibly disappointing that Metrorail hasn't expanded the way it was promised in long-range planning. On the other hand, I can think of several US metro areas that are similar in size to Miami that would probably kill to have the beginnings of a heavy rail network that's this functional. With just 3 days, I didn't have time to explore the whole system really deeply, so I did focus on everything from Brickell south, where the most interesting redevelopment is currently underway. The Metrorail stations aren't super attractive. The word brutalist comes to mind, but brutalism can be okay, as long as the stations are functional. So let's talk functionality, starting with land use. My understanding is they have recently upzoned around all Metrorail stations, and you're starting to see some new density at several of the stops. And that's really encouraging because it took decades to get to this point. If you wonder why I talk about affordable urbanism and affordable walkability on this channel so much, this is really what it's all about. Building a ton of housing supply, easy walking distance to high quality transit nodes, with all the shopping and services you need on a daily basis, either walking distance or a quick train ride away. Making that kind of thing affordable is, to me, the biggest issue in urbanism. Reasonably priced housing options in places where you can live without all the expense, all the impacts, and all the sheer aggravation of owning a car. Like here at Douglas Road Station, development is really starting to open up. I would just suggest that if you're a city like Miami and you need to add like 50,000 housing units, just put them all within a quarter-mile radius of Metrorail stations. I'll come back to Douglas Road because it's fascinating. Land use around the Metrorail stations is a bit all over the map. Dadeland South, the immediate station area is underwhelming, but starting about a block away, you've got what they're calling downtown Dadeland, which is technically not a real city, but it's city enough for me. What's more noticeable in direct proximity to the Metrorail stations, unfortunately, is enormous multi-story parking structures. And look, I understand the inclination to try to put as many parking spaces as possible right next to a rail station to try to goose ridership numbers, but in the long term, it's pretty counterproductive. You're not really getting the return on investment you should be getting in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled, GHG emissions, and just creating more livable places that you would if you just built hundreds more housing units. I mean, the size of these things is just jaw-dropping. I was staying in Brickell and I had to see this one out my window every day. It's like 14 stories high. Brickell was loaded with above-ground parking garages, and really all of the denser parts of the metro area are. It's a testament to the car dependency of the local culture, but it's also a testament to how incredibly difficult it is to excavate and build underground parking garages or underground anything in South Florida. Some of this is truly absurd, like at Dadeland North, there's density, as well as some truly disturbing public art installations. I mean, the kind of thing that haunts your dreams. But then you also have this, an open-air shopping center where they decided to just design it with structured parking on one face. And look, I don't know if Miami actually has more parking than the average US city, but it's definitely more conspicuous for the same reasons, to be fair, that all the rail transit in Miami is pretty conspicuous. It all has to be elevated because tunneling is just too problematic. Just within a single block downtown, Metrorail, Metromover, and Brightline are all elevated. I'll come back to downtown later. By the way, I don't have a super strong opinion on elevated versus underground when it comes to heavy rail. There are trade-offs and it's context dependent, but Miami has started to weave a linear park into the Metrorail alignment. Unfortunately, the investment to this point has mostly been focused on more affluent areas like Brickell, but you can get here on the train by definition, so it is a public space for everybody. Okay, let's dig into the Transit Alliance's scorecard, which they put together to really communicate the state of the transportation system to a general audience. It's concise and readable, and it hits on some big evergreen points like basically all high pedestrian crash corridors are stroads, but also lots of detail that helped me understand gaps and deficiencies and the particulars of how transit works in Miami-Dade County. Like, rail is always very legible to me, but bus systems are hard to interpret as a first-timer. Basically, all of the Metrorail stations do have a transit center of some sort, and Dadeland South, at the end of the line, connects to a dedicated busway that continues south. What I really had a tough time grasping, though, was these rubber-tired trolleys that are seemingly everywhere. These often connect from Metrorail stations to more historic and traditional main streets and downtowns that are not really far, but aren't in convenient walking distance from the stations. I'll come back to some of these later. The scorecard digs into this dynamic a bit. The station areas themselves are considered walkable by the nation's foremost authority on walkability, but I love that the scorecard points out that all these stations I'm talking about are basically on Highway 1, which has a high posted speed and is frankly pretty hostile to pedestrians, which I'll get to in a minute. Just note that this table has a column with the header, "Is it a stroad?" I don't think you would have seen this kind of terminology in any kind of planning document like 5 years ago, and now it's just effective shorthand. There is sort of a supreme irony in building a high-capacity rail alignment along this kind of legacy state highway, and like 40 years later, the rail service and development around it have had their ups and downs, but the stroad is just as stroady as ever. Make no mistake, US 1 or the South Dixie Highway, which runs along the east side of the Metrorail alignment, is about as bad as you can imagine, and that means you have some pretty atrocious connectivity in the eastern half of the catchment area around each station. It's actually amazing the system has as much ridership as it does. If there's an at-grade crossing, it's not even going to necessarily be conveniently located to a station entrance, and crossing US 1 is an absolute chore. First of all, the cycle lengths are completely bonkers, and no, I'm not going to take 3 minutes of this video to show you because this video is going to be long and that would be a boring 3 minutes, but trust me, the whole experience is very undignified. I just want to point out that walkability and connectivity should be a very big deal here. Miami, kind of infamously, has nice temperatures at times of year when some US cities are just frozen over. I guess the exception is summer. Yeah, I just had to come to Miami in July, just in time for record high temperatures, apparently. And look, I spent a whole year living in Vegas, so I'm used to quote-unquote hot weather, but Vegas doesn't have anything like this kind of humidity, so there are levels to this. And some of the local population is actually equipped for this climate, just not me. So in between the relatively dense nodes at the Metrorail stations, which are usually more than a mile apart, you get a lot of the kind of land uses you'd expect to get on a stroad like US 1. Honestly, even at the stations themselves sometimes. The trains are actually great. As fast as people drive on US 1, Metrorail is still faster, and especially when there are stoplights. But it's just wild that despite all this, you still have stuff like literal car dealerships right across from Metrorail stations. The driving environment is pretty wild. I mean, I do understand how, as a driver, you might not want to slow down or stop in the right lane when you're trying to take a right turn into a driveway because you don't want the car behind you that's going like 50 to plow into you. But maybe that's why pedestrians get hit in places like this, which is why a lot of times you'll see roads like this built with deceleration lanes. But those don't have any place in a transit-oriented environment. So the whole thing just really needs to be reimagined and redesigned. High speed plus lots of driveway cuts is just never going to be pedestrian friendly. Crossing US 1, the at-grade signalized crossings are infrequent. They require you to wait a long time because of the long cycle lengths. And when the walk signal comes, it's either a very long crossing across a lot of lanes, or they might give you a 2-stage crossing where you have to spend an entire cycle waiting in the median for the next walk phase. This is assuming the pedestrian call buttons work at all, which unfortunately it turned out was not a given. A couple times I just gave up and tried to interpolate where the walk signal was supposed to show up, and I just went for it. Fortunately, I didn't end up in the pedestrian fatality statistics, but it wasn't easy. FDOT, get it together. The other thing we have to get into is pedestrian bridges over US 1, which I guess in a very narrow sense are safer than at-grade crossings. Like this one at University Station, there isn't a signalized crossing at all, so you don't really have a choice. Like they just could not spare the green time out of the signal cycle. They had to add inconvenience for people walking and using transit so they could have more convenience for people using the least safe, most polluting mode of transportation. So you have to go up and across, and when you get to the station, it doesn't connect, of course, because the ped bridge is the same height as the center platform. So you have to go back down to get to the fare gates so you can go back up to the platform. This is like station connectivity as abstract art. Douglas Road is a bit different. There is an at-grade crossing you can use if the pedestrian call buttons actually work. But otherwise, it's the same up and over and back down, so you can access the fare gates. But in this case, you have to go through like a cyclone fence cattle chute. And then where it looks like there's an entrance from a distance, there isn't one. You have to go around to the back side of the station. In fairness, it looks like the construction that's happening here is actually putting in a station entrance on the east side, but I can only really talk about what I see out there today. And it's like a chutes and ladders situation. Okay, so the station areas are a bit of a mixed bag, trending, I think, in a good direction. So let's start looking at some of the parts of Miami that aren't right next to Metrorail stations, which does describe the vast majority of Miami-Dade County. You know, in advance of these trips, I try to put the word out on social media so people can chime in on what they think I should go see or film. And by the way, give me your Minneapolis ideas down in the comments. But this time I got one that just stuck in my head the whole time I was walking around filming. I can't even find it anymore, but if you're watching, you'll know who you are. The comment was something like, Miami is walkable urbanism for the rich and car dependency for everyone else, which is sort of true for all US cities in some sense, but it really jumps out at you here. You just can't unsee it. And I'm not just talking about the ersatz main streets and manufactured public spaces like lifestyle centers, although there are those. Mostly, I mean legitimate historic main streets. 72nd Street in South Miami, the Miracle Mile in Coral Gables, which is a bit of a traffic sewer, but they've spared no expense to beautify the pedestrian realm. And Geralda Plaza, also in Coral Gables, relatively recently pedestrianized. So bollards for the rich, unfettered vehicle access for the masses. Downtown Coconut Grove. Look, I'm not saying every neighborhood wants or needs bougie high-end restaurants or hipster artisan ice cream shops or whatever this place is selling, but everyone deserves a walkable environment. And I don't know that the city of Miami has that much influence on land use and transportation relative to the county or FDOT, but I also don't know that it helps you do the work of the people having your city hall in this high price tag of a location. I mean, if I get a high-powered planning job at the city of Miami, do I get lunch at the Bayshore Club every day? I'm just curious. Brickell is organized around an elevated station, but it has that same feel to it. But what I ultimately realized on this trip was, if I was going to take my urbanist YouTube talents to South Beach, it wasn't going to be by rail. I had to take the Metromover to the Omni Station Transit Center and hop a bus, which isn't a tragedy, but why in 2023 there isn't a rail connection of some kind is beyond me. Anyway, some notable things about Miami Beach. The ocean access is pretty phenomenal. The Miami modern Art Deco architecture all over the place is distinctive, in a good way, I think. Ocean Drive has a two-way protected bike lane, and even though it was in the mid to high 90s with a dew point of like 80 when I shot this, the city bikes were getting a surprising amount of use. You know, someone recently generated a DALL-E showing Ocean Drive completely car-free, and it was quickly pointed out that Ocean Drive actually was car-free earlier in the pandemic, and there's been lots of talk about making that permanent. It just wasn't happening when I was there. In keeping with a theme, Miami Beach is not super affordable, but does have all kinds of walkable urbanism. Espinal Way, pedestrianized. Lincoln Road, pedestrian zones, and fine public art for the rich, stroads for everyone else. Also, and I can't emphasize this enough, lush tree canopies for the rich and urban heat islands for the masses. Look, I'm not a certified arborist, but shade is important, especially when you're setting temperature records. And I get why there aren't a lot of shade trees in like Las Vegas because it doesn't really rain there. Miami has rain, stay tuned. And you can grow perfectly good shade trees, which was apparent in Miami Beach. Okay, I've got more to come, if you can believe it, including various crimes against urbanism and humanity that are being perpetrated by the state DOT. But first, usual reminder to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this urbanism tour of South Florida. Can I say SoFlo? Connect on the apps for more of my foolishness, and direct support on Patreon is always appreciated. But if you're in the mood to support an advocacy nonprofit that's working in what's really one of America's great cities, but also a city that clearly needs a lot of help in terms of transportation and urbanism, consider donating to the Miami Transit Alliance. Or better yet, if you live in South Florida, they're always looking for volunteers. I've got links down in the description because there are exciting things happening. I understand a bus network redesign is going to be kicking off later this year, and the Transit Alliance will be engaged in that. Okay, let's talk about downtown and adjacent neighborhoods because there's just a lot going on. The new Miami Central station, where you catch Brightline, kind of gives you the sense of the direction the city is headed. And no, I did not ride Brightline this time. It's gonna have to happen on a separate trip. But I did run into several of the Brightlines at grade crossings as I explored further north in Midtown, which is kind of exploding with new dense development, including signs yelling at you to invest in real estate, and really nice newly developed streetscapes. More walkable urbanism for the people who can afford it. Similar dynamic in the quote-unquote design district further north, which I'd hoped was named in reference to like cool architects and industrial designers, but I think it just means expensive handbag design. And let's hit Wynwood. These are all areas in different phases of transition with lots of housing infill. Wynwood's claim to fame is just tons of murals and street art. I kind of want to do a video just about the urbanism of street art, how it's used, what it communicates, the importance of authenticity. Let me know if you want it. The Metromover doesn't get up this far, unfortunately, but I'd love to see an extension. I don't think I've even talked about this yet. I'm generally not a fan of low capacity fixed guideway systems, but I don't know, it was pretty useful. The Metromover opened in 1987 and they charged fares early on, but I think it cost more to administer a payment system than they recouped in actual fares. So I believe it went fareless in 2002 and ridership promptly doubled. It is seen as a feeder and a last mile solution for downtown Metrorail stations, as well as Metrobus. Anyway, like Metrorail, it is elevated all over downtown and Brickell, and some of the stations are just ridiculously high up. I mean, the tracks have to get way up and over to cross the Miami River. And I can't finish this video without talking about freeways, unfortunately. Maybe this is an easy target, but a common denominator in all the worst aspects of urbanism in basically every American city is the state DOT. FDOT is doubling down on freeways, quite literally. You can travel around and see evidence of them working on double-decking I-395. I understand the project is way over budget, way behind schedule, and this whole area apparently gets completely flooded when the rain comes down, to the point where they call it Lake FDOT. I didn't get a shot of this phenomenon, just Google it. It is funny though, building a transit system that moves people efficiently is a boondoggle, but literally doubling down on car dependency is a sober, common sense investment. And it's actually quite a bit worse than I'm saying. This is a state that, after all, simply ripped apart a culturally vibrant Black community right in the center of the city so they could put in massive freeway interchanges. Some of Overtown's identity still exists despite that, but a lot of the families that lived here got displaced to places like this. Liberty Square, which is mostly a transit desert, a food desert, an urban canopy desert, and a place where there still exist remnants of a wall that separated the housing projects that people got displaced to from adjacent neighborhoods. Pretty grim, and if that isn't enough, it's also home to some of the most unsafe intersections in the city, according to the Transit Alliance's scorecard. This is kind of an evergreen dynamic for basically every city. The neighborhoods where people get displaced to often have the fewest amenities and the worst built environments. One last thing before I wrap this up. A truly shocking number of people drive around South Florida with suspended licenses and/or with no insurance. There's kind of a terrible economic reality behind this, which is if you're trying to pay for housing and a car, which is probably necessary in most parts of Miami if you want to hold down a job, there's a good chance you aren't going to be able to afford to pay traffic tickets. This is problematic in a lot of ways, but it really brings home the massive burden and stress that car dependency inflicts on the most economically vulnerable people, and why making it easier to walk and take transit is so important for giving people a path to share in what, in a lot of really obvious ways, is a very prosperous city. Okay, I lied. Quick epilogue. I had a whole section I was gonna do on the Metrorail connection to the airport because it's pretty wild, but the insane weather I'd been dreading the whole trip finally arrived on the day I had to leave, and the Orange Line was just shut down. Don't worry though, climate change isn't real. Just keep building 14-story parking garages and double-decking freeways. And that is all I've got, finally. Thanks for joining today, and thanks to the patrons for helping fund a lot of this trip, and thanks to the Miami Transit Alliance as well. Honestly, the big takeaway here is probably that I'm very willing to travel the country, highlighting nonprofits and advocacy groups doing great work in all kinds of interesting cities. So come at me with your offers. Otherwise, keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new installment next week, and I'll see you then.